So anyway, next month, November 12th, we're having Ed Johnson here for the Brown Bag, talking about fraternal societies providing valuable services. We also have two other upcoming events that I wanted to mention. This Saturday, Barb Garrett is coming and doing a history on quilt making via doll quilts. So she actually put the doll, is it not working? No. She made reproductions of historical quilts, and she'll actually take us through the history through these doll quilts. That starts at 10 a.m. and it runs until noon. And then November 1st, we have the square storage basket weaving class that will run from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. So if anyone is interested, please let us know. At this point, could we welcome Bradley Smith up to the front, and we'll talk about Wonderfully Nice.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is very good to be here with you. Also, this is a strange comment. There's a pad here under my feet, and it's so comfortable.
I forgot to hide the view. Sorry, just so you don't have to deal with this.
This pad under my feet is the most comfortable place I've ever stood for a presentation. I'm just amazed. Thank you for a comfortable standing place. So I want to talk today about the Pennsylvania Dutch. But before I do, I want to talk about something a little more important. Oh, do I have to?
We love our technology. There we go.
I want to talk about funnel cake. Funnel cake had a particularly good year in 1998. So why do I say 1998 was a good year for funnel cake? Well, the Los Angeles Times newspaper did a feature story about funnel cake, specifically funnel cake at the Orange County Fair, right outside of Los Angeles. And they had a headline, "Funnel cake makes the fair go round." And in this article, they declared that funnel cake was the king of the Orange County Fair. Quite a distinction. Here's the thing that's amazing about this. Funnel cake was a relatively recent transplant to the Los Angeles area. It's not original to Los Angeles. So where did it come from? Well, if you start to peel back the layers of funnel cake through the historical record, we find that in 1955 or thereabouts, 54, 55, the Chicago Tribune did an article. Mary Mead makes Dutch funnel cake, and that's Dutch as in Pennsylvania Dutch. And has the headline, "This is a Pennsylvania Dutch recipe and makes about 24 medium-sized funnel cakes." So if we go back a little further, we find that the first instances of funnel cake really getting into the mainstream historical record originate with the Kutztown Folk Festival. So the Kutztown Folk Festival begins in the 1950s. And funnel cake really came to us because the Virginville Grange decided they needed something they could make as a fundraiser at the Kutztown Folk Festival. And the woman who kind of brought her family recipe on behalf of the Grange was this woman in the picture. Her name was Emma Miller. Has anyone ever been to Virginville? It's a small town, maybe a population of 200 people. So that's where Emma Miller and this funnel cake recipe is coming from. So they bring their funnel cake recipe to the Kutztown Folk Festival about 1951. The following year, National Geographic magazine visits the Kutztown Folk Festival because they're interested in anything dealing with the cultures of the world. So the folk festival got on their radar. They go and study the folk festival, and they do a major story in the October 1952 issue of National Geographic. And there you can see the sort of headline for the story, Pennsylvania Dutch Folk Festival. And they talk about Emma Miller and the folks from Virginville and their funnel cakes. So we really think this is how funnel cake got onto this on the map of the United States. So from Virginville to the Kutztown Folk Festival to the Chicago Tribune to the Los Angeles Times, it kind of all happened through this National Geographic article. And I think about this often, how amazing it is that this small town recipe from the Pennsylvania Dutch is now at basically every fair and carnival in the United States. And if you ever want to see something funny, read what some of these folks say about the origins of funnel cake. They don't understand it, but they try to sometimes. Funnel cake is not the only contribution made by the Pennsylvania Dutch. The very first pretzel bakery in North America, commercially at least, was in Lancaster County and was started by a Pennsylvania Dutch family. The very first instances of Groundhog Day being celebrated were in Berks County by Pennsylvania Dutch folks. The earliest illustration of an Easter bunny in North America came from about what is today Orwigsburg in Schuylkill County, only about an hour from here. The earliest illustration of a Christmas tree in North America in the early 1800s, rendered by a man named Lewis Miller, is right there, York County, Pennsylvania, another Pennsylvania Dutch person. So we have all these things that kind of originated with the Pennsylvania Dutch. Pennsylvania Dutch also have sort of iconic symbols for which they're well known, such as decorated barn stalls or hex signs, as many people know them. And some really wild artwork, incidentally, that is very much on the radar of nationwide museums, nationally known museums. This is an example. I love this blanket chest. This came from Eastern Lebanon County, and it has camels on it from 1785. And I've always wondered, how did this artist, the artist was from Berks County, how did a Berks County artist in the 1780s even know what a camel looked like? Well, this fellow did, sort of. This is one of my favorite pieces of Pennsylvania Dutch art. It is a baptism certificate from the 1700s, and it has mermaids at the top, which you can see right there. It has parrots. It even has seahorses, or at least the artist's attempt to illustrate a seahorse. So I have an ongoing discussion with my brother. My brother says, you know, you hear so much about the Pennsylvania Dutch. I kind of feel like it's overhyped. There's too much being said about it. And I've always argued, no, it's not that prominent in conversations. And at any rate, we had this debate one time, and to kind of prove him wrong, I pulled up the Penn State University library catalog, and I typed the term Pennsylvania Dutch. And I wanted to prove to my brother that the subject of the Pennsylvania Dutch has not been discussed all that much by scholars. So I typed this term, and you'll never believe how many hits I've gotten. Books and media, 1,279 hits. Journal articles, 33,400 hits. And this is from about 3 years ago. And as I've thought about it, I realized, well, maybe my brother is right. There has been an awful lot written about the Pennsylvania Dutch, about the language, their cooking, their folklore and religion, their art, the hex signs, their holiday traditions, architecture, furniture, music, and folklore. So many aspects of their culture actually have been studied a lot by scholars. And yet I find that so many people don't even know what it means when I say Pennsylvania Dutch. They don't understand what that means. So I always like to explore the question, who are the Pennsylvania Dutch? And to illustrate the complexity of this issue, I'm going to show you a little cartoon. So that is cartoon me. I don't quite have that much hair, but just pretend. That's me as a cartoon. So that's me. And this is just a random person on the street. And over and over and over again, I have this recurring conversation with people that I meet. And it goes like this. I am Pennsylvania Dutch. So that's what I will say. And over again, I hear the same response. But you don't look Amish. If I had $1 for every time I've heard that, I could retire almost. Pennsylvania Dutch does not always equal Amish, but it is a common misunderstanding. It's a misconception. And I've been very interested in exploring and understanding, why does this misconception exist? And I think it really stems back to the 1940s and 1950s. After World War II, we have a growing tourism industry in Lancaster County. And the Lancaster County tourism industry is really pushing this sort of peaceful, bucolic, relaxing Amish countryside. And you see a lot of literature like this Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch tourist guide. And what's interesting about this is you see images of Amish folks on the left, but on the right, you see artistic motifs that are Pennsylvania Dutch, but are not what you'd affiliate with the Amish. So in other words, the tourism industry and their promotional materials kind of just had this mashup of symbols that didn't necessarily belong together. And it kind of created a situation where Amish and Pennsylvania Dutch became synonymous with one another. So here's another one, greetings from the heart of the Pennsylvania Dutch country, with a group of Amish. So who actually are the Pennsylvania Dutch? If you would look at sort of a cross-section of the Pennsylvania Dutch in about 1750, the breakdown by religious affiliation would look kind of like the following. About 45% would be Lutheran, 45% German Reformed, and then we have sort of the remaining 10% with a variety of different groups like Amish, Moravian, Mennonite, Schwenkfelder, Church of the Brethren, groups like that. To put it another way, some scholars will say that about 90% are what we call fancy Dutch, and 10% were plain Dutch, folks who purposely sought a more simple, less showy lifestyle. So the Pennsylvania Dutch, most of them came from Southwest Germany and Switzerland. However, we certainly had groups coming from what's today Czech Republic, from Poland, from German-speaking areas. That's where a lot of Moravians came from. That's where Schwenkfelders came from. But the biggest concentration is in Southwest Germany, in the areas on the map in red. So from these areas, we get about 80,000 people leaving Europe, and then their descendants as well would count as Pennsylvania Dutch. And they emigrated from a period of about 1683 to 1775. So why did they come? Well, for some folks, religious persecution was very much a factor. And that's very much the case for the Schwenkfelders, and especially for Swiss Mennonites who were living in Switzerland in the early 1600s, who were oftentimes killed for their religious beliefs. Now, I mentioned 90% just about are Lutheran or German Reformed. They didn't have that religious persecution, but they had serious problems of their own due to the fact that Southwest Germany in the 1600s was almost constantly being impacted by wars. Some of the wars you may have heard of, many of them we haven't heard of, like the 30 Years' War, the 9 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, all these different wars that really created a difficult situation in Southwest Germany. Sometimes it meant people were literally at the receiving end of attacks and pillaging. In many instances, though, it simply meant that there was a situation where people were becoming refugees. And as refugees, they were leaving their farms, leaving their crops on short notice simply to escape from invading armies. And if you're getting up and leaving your crop halfway through the growing season, this is going to create serious, serious problems for feeding yourself and your community. So you have kind of a situation where people are not always necessarily being directly attacked, but kind of living this refugee lifestyle of always being on the run, trying to stay one step ahead of invading armies. So on top of that, in the 1600s, we had this sort of strange blip, this climatic blip, this weather phenomenon that scientists today call the Little Ice Age, where temperatures were colder, growing seasons were shorter. And the bottom line is this resulted in famine and food shortages that just added to the hardships that people were having in Europe at the time. So as we get into the late 1600s and early 1700s, Pennsylvania is established by William Penn, and William Penn is looking to bring settlers into his colony of Pennsylvania. And he goes to these regions, Southwest Germany, Switzerland, places like that, because he knows that there are people here who've just had a really hard time. And he invites them, he encourages them, come to Pennsylvania. We have religious freedom, we have plenty of land, we have no war. In fact, we are a colony without even a militia because we don't believe in war. So this is very appealing, and that's why we get 80,000 people accepting that invitation. So these 80,000 folks come to Pennsylvania during about not quite a 90-year window, from 1683 to 1775. Well, actually, that is a 90-year window, 92-year window. They stop coming in 1775 because the American Revolution breaks out. The British blockade American port cities, and that kind of effectively puts an end, at least to the major wave of immigration. So the folks leaving, they would kind of follow, many of them, the Rhine River, go to the city of Rotterdam where they'd board a ship and they'd come to Pennsylvania. And this is a map that kind of shows some of the major areas where they settled. So I work at a museum in Lancaster County. So that's right there in the thick of things. But where we are right now is really just on the edge of sort of this core area of Pennsylvania Dutch settlement. One of the questions that often comes up is, what's the difference between Pennsylvania Dutch and Pennsylvania German? This is a source of much confusion. The short answer is it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Pennsylvania Dutch is a term that was used traditionally, but in the late 1800s, scholars were concerned that people would misunderstand the origins of the Pennsylvania Dutch, think they were from the Netherlands, so they started using the term Pennsylvania German, thinking it would help bring clarity. But it actually just brought confusion, I think, because people now think these are two different groups. So that's a little bit about who the Pennsylvania Dutch people are. What is the Pennsylvania Dutch language, though? Well, this also requires a visit with the cartoon rad and a conversation, another conversation that I have over and over again goes like this. I'll say the following. I speak Pennsylvania Dutch. And what I will hear many times in response is, that's just German gibberish corrupted by English. And that's just not true. It's not true. But again, it's another misconception, very common misconception. And again, it is the fault of the Lancaster tourism industry because of books like this. Behoodled English. Behoodled is the Pennsylvania Dutch word for mixed up or confused. And this book was so popular, they had a second edition. And then more recently, we had How to Speak Dutchified English. And then that one was so popular, we have a second volume actually comes out. So these books come out and it just fuels that misconception that it's just a silly gibberish language. And my mom in particular gets very upset about this because she came from a family they spoke Pennsylvania Dutch as their first language. So English was a second language for them, even though their family had been in this country since 1775. And they struggled with their English. Their English was not good. And when my mom was little, she had a school teacher, her fourth grade teacher, really gave her a hard time about the way she talked. My mom is now 82. She's still very sensitive about this. And she finds this kind of thing hurtful, actually. But at any rate, to understand the language, we have to kind of go in a time machine, go back in time about 525 years to the year 1500, and kind of understand what the situation was in Europe. And the most important thing to understand is that there was no such thing as Germany in the year 1500. Germany did not yet exist. If you looked at a map of where Germany is today, this is how it would look. I look at that and think, this is a cartographer's worst nightmare. It's a crazy grouping of kingdoms and fiefdoms and principalities all over the map, constantly changing and very confusing, a confusing geopolitical landscape. So there is no nation of Germany. There's no German national identity. There's no standard German language. Instead, people speak regional dialects. They speak the dialect of their region and they associate with the region where they live. So you don't say, I'm a German and I speak German. You might say, I'm Swabian and I speak the Swabian dialect. I'm Hessian and I speak the Hessian dialect. I'm Alsatian and I speak the Alsatian dialect. Now let's say you are down here. Hopefully you can see my mouse moving on the Swab. Oh, it's not showing up. There it is. Okay. Where I move my mouse on my screen here is different than there. So at the bottom of the map, there's a yellow area that says Swabia. Just to the east of that is West Central Bavaria. Those are different dialect regions, but they're geographically close. So if you go from one to another, you'll notice a difference in those dialects, but the difference is small. You'll be able to pretty easily have a conversation with each other. But let's say if you go from the Swabian area at the very bottom of the map to the very top of the map where they speak the Schleswigish dialect, geographically, it's a much farther distance. So what will happen is with farther geographic difference comes greater dialect difference. So you have a much harder time getting a Swabian speaker and a Schleswigish speaker to understand each other. But that's what the dialect situation was in Germany in the year 1500. Germans spoke many different regional dialects. Not too many people at this time were literate, but those that do, especially for church or government types of business, they're reading and writing still in Latin in 1500. It's kind of a similar situation in the German-speaking areas of Switzerland, where there are regional Germanic dialects. Each one is a little bit different. The farther you get geographically from two dialect areas, the more significant the differences are in the dialect. So this situation starts to change, though, as we get into the 1520s, 1530s, because of this fellow, Martin Luther. So Martin Luther, a lot of us know of him. He's kind of considered the person who kickstarted the Protestant Reformation. He establishes the Lutheran Church in America. Martin Luther had a great interest in creating a Bible that was not in Latin, a Bible in the native language of people who'd be using it. So for him, that means German. The only problem is we don't really have German. We just have all these regional dialects. So Martin Luther was from an area where they spoke a dialect known as Upper Saxon. So what Martin Luther basically started to do was he started to write a Bible using his Upper Saxon dialect as a base, but doing lots and lots of research on the words used by different regions, the words common to different dialects. It's been said that he would spend 1 month sometimes just studying a single word in order to get it right. So as he's doing this studying of the dialects and of words and idioms, just the expressions people use, he is writing and writing his German translation of a Bible. And it takes him years to do this, but finally he finishes in the 1530s, and this becomes very, very popular. In fact, by the mid-1500s, 500,000 copies of Martin Luther's Bible have been purchased by people in present-day Germany. And here's what's interesting about this. Martin Luther really sought to create a theological revolution by making the Bible available in the native language of German people. But in doing this, he created a literacy revolution and a linguistics revolution. Because what happened is people by the hundreds of thousands are buying this Bible and they can't really read it, but they have a motivation to learn. And families would gather around the table with their Bible, the only book in the house, and they'd work their way through it. And slowly they would gain literacy by reading this Bible in sort of what I call the standard German of Martin Luther. So let's advance 200 years in time to the year 1700. There is still no Germany. The dialects still prevail as the languages of daily conversation. However, we have a big difference now. The big difference now is many can now read and write in Martin Luther's German. So this is the time period, 1700, immigration to Pennsylvania is underway. And the people are speaking these dialects in Germany. They're speaking their Swiss dialects. And if you kind of superimpose these two maps, it would look kind of like this. And what ends up happening, these are the dialects that most strongly influence Pennsylvania. Now, there were other areas, for example, the Muhlenberg family, who settled just down the road from us. They are not from this region. They're more from northern Germany, sort of central Germany. So there are people outside these regions, but this is where 95% of the immigrants are coming from. So these are the regions that are going to most strongly influence the languages being spoken in Pennsylvania. So people leave these regions and they settle here in Pennsylvania. And a curious thing happens. These Southwest German and Swiss dialects, which are pretty similar to begin with, blend together. It takes about 50 years for this blending to happen. But once this blending kind of gets moving, it evolves into what is Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, just to give you an example of how the blending happened, I'm going to look at the word potato. Potato in the dialect of West Pfälzisch And East Pfälzisch is different. In the West, they say Grumbier, or Grumbier for one, Grumbier. But in the East, they say Grumbia. If you go further down to Swabia, they use a K. They say Krumbier. So Grumbier, Grumbia, Krumbier. Grumbier kind of emerges as the word in Pennsylvania Dutch. So they were all pretty close, but one kind of becomes the preferred usage. So in that way, many dialects blend together to become essentially a new language based on old dialects. And that's what Pennsylvania Dutch is. So by 1800, we have an interesting situation in Pennsylvania. The blending of the dialects into Pennsylvania Dutch is complete. And 40% of Pennsylvania residents speak Pennsylvania Dutch. 40%, that's incredible. It's a lot of people. And Pennsylvania Dutch are reading and writing in Standard German, the German of Martin Luther. And we know this because we have lots of literature, things they wrote, things they read in Standard German. So here's an example. This is the Bible in Standard German. It says the Bible, the entire Holy Scriptures, Old and New Testaments from the translation of Martin Luther. This is from 1847. This is from my own family. This Bible belonged to Rosina Smith, my great-great-great-grandmother. So she's someone who would have been speaking Pennsylvania Dutch, but reading and writing in the German of Martin Luther. So Pennsylvania Dutch folks were actually pretty well educated, even in the 1700s. And they were going to schools that were private schools run by churches. So for example, in Reading, we have Trinity Lutheran School, which opens in 1765, when Reading is only about 17 years old. Berks County is only about 12 years old at the time. And this is a place where you're being educated in math and science kind of things, but also German reading and writing. So this continues for a long time until 1834. We have a new Pennsylvania state law, the Pennsylvania School Act of 1834. And it basically creates free public schools for the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But the new schools are going to be taught in English. This really creates a dilemma for the Pennsylvania Dutch. They have to decide which choice is better. Do we stay with our traditions and keep sending our children to private schools where they can learn standard German, reading and writing of our ancestors, but we have to pay for that? Or do we send them to the new public schools, which are completely free, but will be focused on education in English? I like to joke and say this really was a quandary for the Pennsylvania Dutch, because the Pennsylvania Dutch don't like change. So they're not going to want to go to those English language schools. But they also don't like spending money. So it's a paradox. What do they do? What do they do? Well, eventually, saving money wins out. It takes about 30 years. It takes about 30 years. But by about the Civil War, they're really making the shift in large numbers. So for example, that Trinity Lutheran School in Reading, they hang on for almost 30 more years before they closed in 1861, right as the Civil War is starting. So let's fast forward now to 1950. 1950, it's been over 100 years since we were switching over to English language public schools. So as a result, very few people are still using standard German for reading and writing. Only the oldest of the fancy Dutch and some of the plain Dutch, like Old Order Amish and Old Order Mennonites, are still using German. But we still have 500,000 people that speak Pennsylvania Dutch in Pennsylvania. However, the language is in decline. And there are a few things really threatening Pennsylvania Dutch language. One is we've had two wars, World War I and World War II, which suddenly have made it very unpopular to embrace anything Germanic. But on top of that, we have just the way education is handled, especially as we're moving away from the one-room schoolhouse model. Parents are concerned that if they teach Pennsylvania Dutch as a first language to their children, that it will hold them back in school. So they start teaching English as the first language to their babies instead of Pennsylvania Dutch. There's a really good book that came out in 1950. I like it a lot. It's by a man named Frederick Claes. It's called The Pennsylvania Dutch. And I love this book because it's old enough to have this quaint charm, but new enough to be grounded in good research and modern scholarship methodology. In 1950, Frederick Claes says the following: "It is clear that Pennsylvania Dutch is in trouble, and in 100 years, it will be dead." That is that's a disconcerting thought. And it was made 75 years ago. So let's jump ahead to today, 2025. What is the status of the Pennsylvania Dutch language, the Pennsylvania Dutch people? Well, it depends who you ask. The Reading Eagle had an article, well, it's almost 20 years ago now, and the article headline said, "Dying dialect, young not learning Pennsylvania German." So this is definitely the Frederick Claes position, that Pennsylvania Dutch language and culture are in trouble. But then we have a funny thing happen a few years, about a decade after that, actually. The Allentown Morning Call has an article, "Why Pennsylvania Dutch is Thriving." So if you look at these headlines, they're incongruous. They don't seem to line up. So which is correct? I think they're both half right and half wrong. And it goes back to this model. The language is thriving with the plain Dutch, but it's dying out, critically endangered, in fact, with the fancy Dutch. Does this matter? I've heard people say, well, if the plain Dutch are speaking it, who cares? It's the language is preserved as an artifact, as a language, as a symbol of culture. It survives. But I kind of think it does matter. And if you get into cultural anthropology, there's something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And the very simplified version of what that hypothesis says is this: language is the glue that keeps many elements of a unique culture alive and intact. So if your culture has unique cooking and art and holidays and songs and furniture, things like that, that's great. But the glue that holds it all together is the language. When you lose that language, you lose the glue, and it's kind of hard to keep all those elements together. So incidentally, I work currently at the Ephrata Cloister Historic Site in Lancaster County, but I've been very much involved with the Berks History Center in Reading. And the Berks History Center, we started offering Pennsylvania Dutch classes about 4 or 5 years ago, for the simple reason that we think it is important there to preserve Pennsylvania Dutch language because it is a glue that holds cultural elements together. So that is a little background about the people, the Pennsylvania Dutch people, and the Pennsylvania Dutch language. But I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't teach you something in Pennsylvania Dutch while I'm here. Just curious, is there anyone here that already speaks Pennsylvania Dutch? A couple people. Zelfs wunderbar. So when I was little, I heard Pennsylvania Dutch all the time. All the time. Not so much anymore. Not so much anymore. The people that taught me Dutch, that spoke Dutch to me, are all passed away. So I can only talk with you. But I'm going to teach you a poem that I was taught when I was a very little boy, maybe 3 years old. I learned this poem. And what I'll do is I'll say the whole poem, and then I'll say it line by line and have you repeat after me. So the poem goes like this. De Chani gate fat, de Chani gate fat, de Chani gate iva die brick. Die brick is verbroken, de Chani is versova, de Chani komt niet terug. So that poem says, Johnny goes away, Johnny goes away. Johnny goes over the bridge. The bridge is broken. Johnny has drowned. Johnny is never coming home again. What a terrible thing to teach a 3-year-old. What's wrong with my parents and grandparents? I don't know, but if you think about it, Rockabye Baby's not exactly a warm and heartwarming little song either. So now what I'll do is I'll say a line, and I'd like you to repeat after me, and we'll say this poem together. De Chani gate fat. De Chani gate fat. De Chani gate iva die brick. Die brick is verbroken. De Chani's versova. De Chani geht nimmer zurück. Actually, I said it wrong. It should be kommt nimmer zurück. I apologize. But good job. Good job. Good job, everyone. So that concludes my talk, but I'd be very happy to answer questions. However, if you have a question, since we have online folks, we have to handle it in a little bit different way. If you have a question, please ask your question, and then I will repeat that question into my microphone so that the folks at home can hear. And while I'm curious to hear your thoughts, anything you say from the audience can't be heard on the virtual microphone. So I'll just say, if you have a thought, I'd love to hear it. But if we could keep that minimum, because the folks at home will just see me standing at the screen and not hear anything. So with that said, does anyone have any questions? Yeah, so people online, if you have questions from the virtual audience, if you type them into the, are you doing a webinar Q&A? So in the Q&A box, we can handle those as well. Yes, Dave.
The plain Dutch, that's the Amish and the Mennonites, how are they both speaking Dutch?
It's a good question. Some Amish actually speak Swiss German dialect. And then you have Amish in Ohio who speak a Dutch. They speak Pennsylvania Dutch, but it's a little different. Now, one of the things I wonder a lot is how pure is the Pennsylvania Dutch, particularly with the Amish? I have concerns about it. So, and I'll tell you a little story that kind of highlights this. I used to work in Lancaster area, and well, I still work in Lancaster County, but I used to work more along Route 30. And I used to go to lunch sometimes to a cafe where an Amish woman worked. And I liked doing that because I talked with her in Pennsylvania Dutch. And we got along pretty well. She could understand me, I could understand her. And one day I wanted a piece of paper. So I asked her, "Hast du ein Stück Papier? Have you a piece of paper?" And she looked at me shocked. I thought, what did I say wrong? She said, "That word, Papier. You're the first person I've heard use that word since my grandmother was alive." I said, "Well, how would you ask for a piece of paper?" And I'll never forget what she said. "Hast du ein Stück paper?" And I found that so interesting. And I've thought about that a lot ever since. She knows what I mean when I say "Hast du ein Stück Papier," because she knew her grandmother, even though that's not a part of her daily lexicon, her vocabulary. She knows the word from her childhood. But her kids won't know that word. They will have had no exposure to it. Her grandchildren will have had no exposure to that word. So if I say to her children, "Hast du ein Stück Papier," they won't know what I'm asking for. They won't know what I'm asking for. And that concerns me. Now, I had a conversation about this recently with a man named Mark Loudon. Mark Loudon is probably the best scholar in North America focused on the ins and outs of the Pennsylvania Dutch language. And Mark Loudon's opinion is that overall, the Amish are preserving Pennsylvania Dutch well enough, and that my concerns I don't need to be worried about. I'm not convinced. Mark is an expert. He knows far more than I do. But if you don't know Babir, how can you say you're maintaining Pennsylvania Dutch? That's kind of my opinion. Now, that said, in places like Kutztown and Ephrata, we have a lot of old order Mennonites who are still teaching Pennsylvania Dutch to their children and teaching a relatively pure Pennsylvania Dutch without the creeping in of English words. There's actually in linguistics a word for this. They call it language contraction. That's when words from a majority language replace words from a minority language slowly over time and kind of dilute the minority language, in this case, Pennsylvania Dutch. So great question. Any other questions?
My father spoke fluently
Hmm.
till he learned English, but he always referred to it as Pennsylvania Deutsch. And he said that meant that was translated to Pennsylvania German. And it's the English who made it into Pennsylvania Dutch.
I'll tell you a story about this. I'm going to jump ahead because I put together some slides anticipating some questions, including your comment. So I know what I know based on what real experts. I consider myself kind of an amateur, but there's some folks that are the real experts. And one I really look to is a fellow whose name was Don Yoder. And Don Yoder is one of the co-founders of the Pennsylvania German Folk Festival. He was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And here's his take on what your dad said. What? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Her dad used to explain about how this whole term Pennsylvania Dutch came to be and the origins of the term Pennsylvania Dutch. So what Don Yoder has explained in his writings is that the English language was very different in the 1600s and 1700s. So if we look at a map of England from, let's say, 1700, there's England. So that's English. And then the Iberian Peninsula, they would call that Spanish. And then anyone speaking French would be French. But then anyone kind of beyond that, they just kind of called them Dutch. It was a very broadly used term. And this is according to Don Yoder. In the 1600s, Dutch didn't mean from the Netherlands, which is right there. In other words, it had a broader definition. And there is Don Yoder, incidentally. So here's a quote that he says about this. The term Dutch goes back way before Shakespeare's time into the Middle Ages, and it meant to an Englishman anyone from the continent of Europe, especially from the Rhine Valley. So that's Don Yoder's take on it. Any other questions?
A question, but I have a comment that might be interesting. According to the book Country by James Lemon, only 13% of the people leaving the Palatinate in that time period, 13% came from North America. The other 87% went to Other areas of Europe, Poland, what has now become Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and other areas of Germany. 13%, that's all that came here.
That's interesting. Well, I'll share a comment that kind of goes. At about the same time, the Pennsylvania Dutch were coming here, and about the time that the British were about to close that off, we have some interesting dynamics happening in Russia, where in Russia, you have the wife of the Tsar, Catherine the Great, has, as far as I know, killed her husband and has taken over as the leader of Russia, even though she herself was German, didn't even speak Russian until she was married. So here you have a German person, the head of Russia, the nation of Russia, and she's a little nervous about this. And what does she want? She wants to bring Germans into the country because bringing in Germans means she's building allies around her. So she tries to create a situation to bring German-speaking people to Russia, and she makes it very beneficial for them, very attractive to them. For example, she says, if you come to Russia, you will be excused from any requirements related to military service. And because in Germany, you had a lot of people just kind of being conscripted into armies at the time. So she's saying, if you come to Russia, that will not happen. No military service required of you. That's particularly appealing to Mennonites. So you have a lot of Mennonites who end up going to Russia. And so, yeah, exactly as you're saying. So his comment, by the way, for the online audience was that there was immigration, of course, to North America, but there was a lot of movement to other areas, not to North America, but to other areas of Europe and so forth. Yes.
Douglas Davenport, who currently has a Facebook page called Pennsylvania Dutch 101, is in Brazil. And
Yes.
he's been visiting with German descendants of German immigrants from the Palatine region who went to Brazil in the early 1800s. And he is noting on his daily posts the similarities to the dialect of those Germans and their foodways and culture, that they continued those traditions of the Palatines, but in Brazil.
Yeah, I knew that he was down there, but I didn't realize he was finding those similarities. So for the online folks, one person commented that there's a fellow named Doug Maidenford, who's very well known in sort of Pennsylvania Dutch circles. And he's right now working on a documentary film about Southwest Germans that settled in Brazil, and in Brazil today still maintain language, food, and cultural traditions very similar to the Pennsylvania Dutch, which is really fascinating. All right, I'm going to make one final comment, sort of a pitch. If you have any Dutch classes, that's an email you can use to read. I'd be glad to hear from you and would be glad to tell you more about what is available. So the Berks History Center, I'll just say, we have beginner, intermediate, and advanced level Pennsylvania Dutch classes. And when we started them, it was very much a work in progress, a trial and error situation. We've been now at it about 4 years, and we're getting better at it, learning how to teach. Yes. It's a mixture of in-person and online. So depending on the audience preferences, we've been getting more demand for the online versions, but our goal is to offer both.
Question.
Okay.
Thank you for paying attention.
Oh, My pleasure. The online person says, thank you for paying attention to the online listeners. It's easy to overlook. So we're trying our best and we thank you to the online crowd for your patience. I've got a couple hands here. So I'll start in the front row here.
Just curiosity, my great-grandparents came from Germany in 1880. Would they have been able to understand Pennsylvania?
That's a great question. So the question was, her grandparents came from Germany in the 1880s. Would they have understood Pennsylvania Dutch? So it's an interesting thing that happened in Pennsylvania, well, in America. So Pennsylvania Dutch, 1775, their big wave of immigration is cut off by the British-American Revolution blockade. Now, after the Revolutionary War ends and the blockade is lifted, there's a trickle of immigration, but it's never a big wave again. Then as we get into the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, you have new waves of German immigrants coming, and they're coming to Pennsylvania. They're settling communities like Columbus, Ohio. They're going to Chicago, Illinois, Bismarck, South Dakota or North Dakota. So they're settling all across the country. So these basically 19th century German immigrants, like you asked about. So they are different from the Pennsylvania Dutch really in two ways. A lot of them are coming from different areas of Germany, especially areas in the north, especially more from cities. They have more of an urban background than a rural background. But also, Germany has been evolving a lot. If you go from 1750 to 1850, you have the language is evolving a lot. Cultural identity is evolving a lot. People are starting to think of themselves not just as Swabian or Alsatian, but as German. So there's the beginning of a national identity. So they're very much a different people. However, if someone was coming from Southern Germany and they still held on to those Southern German dialects, then yes, they would have been able to communicate. So the short, I'm being long-winded, the short answer is it depends where they came from. But because of the geography and the time, culturally, they were pretty distinctly different people. Reading, Pennsylvania, we had a lot of Germans settling in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And so it's interesting, in the city of Reading, you have Pennsylvania Germans and German Germans, 19th century Germans, and they didn't quite blend. They were distinctly different cultural groups. There's only one area where I can think of that there was sort of a cultural exchange between the two. It's with the song. Does anyone know the song that the Pennsylvania Dutch culturally appropriated from the standard Germans? Yeah, someone said it, the Schnitzelbank song. Brought here by these 1800s German immigrants. The Pennsylvania Dutch heard that and thought, this is delightful. We have to translate this from German to Pennsylvania Dutch. Does everyone know that song? If you know that song, raise your hand. About a third. Gosh, should I sing a line or two? All right, I'll sing a line or two for the benefit of those who don't know. I wasn't planning on it, but I'll do it. So this is basically a very, very silly song. And that's why the Pennsylvania Dutch loved it. Their music has lots of silliness to it, lots of whimsical themes. So they anything silly and fun, they wanted to incorporate into their music. So the Germans bring over this silly song, and they really like it. So the German version, it's very similar, but they tweak the wording, they tweak the words, the vocabulary, so it's Pennsylvania Dutch. And the basic line is this not a cutting bench? Yes, this is a cutting bench. Is this not a large cupboard? Yes, this is a large cupboard. Large cupboard, cutting bench. Oh, you lovely, oh, you lovely, oh, you lovely cutting bench. Why is a cutting bench lovely? I don't know. But I'll just take 30 seconds and sing you the song. So it goes like this. I hope I don't blow up the online world with the desk. Ist das nicht ein Schnitzelbank? Ja, das ist ein Schnitzelbank. Ist das nicht ein großer Schank? Ja, das ist ein großer Schank. Großer Schank, Schnitzelbank. I do Shaney, I do Shaney, I do Shaney, Schnitzelbank. Now that I sang it, anyone recognize it? So there were some more hands, fellow in the back there.
I don't believe you come across proper alphabets.
Hmm.
According to which category?
So great question. So Pennsylvania Dutch have a very, very rich artistic tradition. And especially if you go to historic tract, they're very, very interested in the art traditions of the Pennsylvania Dutch. And so Proctor initially kind of had a narrow definition, specifically about, oh, I'm sorry, to the online crowd. There's a question about Pennsylvania Dutch Proctor and Proctor lettering. So the Proctor tradition, it specifically referred to the lettering used in this type of art form. Proctor comes from a Latin word from which we get the English word fractured or broken. So it refers to the fact that the letters have kind of broken pieces in the characters. So that was the original definition. It was a narrow definition. But you saw this type of lettering in baptism certificates, in writing samples, in decorated book plates where they put the name of the owner of a book, in little gifts given to students by school teachers, in house blessings, things like that use this type of lettering. And you'd see with that lettering artwork. And so over time, the narrow definition for the type of lettering came to be used for that entire larger art tradition that uses that type of lettering. In fact, I'm going to go back real quick. I hope this doesn't cause anyone motion sickness. Almost there. Forgot how many slides I had. Now I'm really, really close. So there we go. So this is an example of a baptism certificate, and the letters there on the screen, they're using that broken writing. So you would say this is Proctor lettering, but in more recent time, this entire document, known as a Taufschein baptism certificate, is just generally called Proctor in sort of a larger, more generic sense. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, what region in Europe did the Moravians live in?
So the Moravians, good question. They came from what is today, as I understand it, the Czech Republic. Kind of if you look at the Czech Republic, you kind of draw a letter C on the eastern, north, and southern border. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they're from the top of the C. In other words, what would be northwest Czech Republic, getting near the German border. Any others? All right. Well, thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure to be here. I thank you for being here. Thanks to the online crowd too.
Thank you so much. There we go.